Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. You'll note from my background that I'm now back in the Bay Area in California, having traveled over the last several weeks to Europe. I was sorry to miss a few of the sessions, but I've watched them all in recording and appreciate Leslie Southwick for covering for me the days that I had to miss. Just got back over the weekend, right as airports and countries around the world were shutting down again in what is now the fifth or sixth wave of the COVID pandemic. We're now being told that there's a new variant emerging out of South Africa called Omicron, and that the world needs to be prepared for further restrictions on our mobility, on our behavior, and the way we interact with people. We all know about Omicron now if you've been watching the news, but I want to bring to your attention a new book that just came out by Robert Kennedy Jr. called The Real Anthony Fauci. I'll put a link to a recent interview he gave on a podcast in which he's echoing Yuval Harari and many other commentaries and saying that what we need to be looking out for more stringently than anything is the way our governments now, in collusion with Big Pharma, and the World Health Organization and others, are using the pandemic to exert authoritarian control. It was Yuval Harari back in March of 2020 in an op-ed in the Financial Times that said his prediction about the pandemic was that it was going to be an occasion where governments, industry would use the occasion of a pandemic to generate fear and begin the construction of what he called a biosecurity state. We saw this in 9/11, how in the aftermath of 9/11 in the United States, they rushed through the Patriot Act and began the consolidation of a national security apparatus. And now we're being we're all bearing witness to the construction of a biosecurity apparatus, the purpose of which is mass control of entire populations by governments and industry. So I just wanted to bring that in as we think about Omicron and we watch the reactions of our governments. It's very important that we understand the context and the layers of purpose that surround our current grappling with a pandemic that doesn't seem to go away. And there are many, many layers to all this, but we're going to have Robert Kennedy Jr. on Humanity Rising in a few weeks. And I just wanted to invite all of us to question authority at this moment when we're facing increased restrictions on our very democratic way of life. As we begin our program, I want to just take a moment and pause with all of you in gratitude that I'm back, and gratitude for all of you who are joining us today, both live here on the Zoom line, but also our live streaming community out there all around the world. It's very good on this Monday to be with you all. Let us take a moment and just pause, as we always do, in all the chaos and tumult of our lives right now, where it seems like we're under assault at almost every single quarter by one force or another, at the center of which is runaway climate change, which we'll be dealing with in a moment. But let us just take a moment to center ourselves in our bodies. Take a breath. And for the next minute or so, if you can, just close your eyes and attune yourself to your heart, to your heartbeat, in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Give thanks and feel love. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our session today, I want to turn our attention to climate change generally, but more specifically to what happened in Glasgow during the Conference of Parties, COP26, the failure of COP26, the moment, as Rupert Reed said, when the world essentially collectively gave up the intention of keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels. And since then, we've been asking the question, what can the progressive movement, what can the climate movement do differently in the aftermath of COP26? Just last week, it was reported that Europe, the entire region of Europe, is now at 2.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. The North Pole, the South Pole, the Arctic, and the Antarctic are 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And so we're moving to a point of such no return that it may soon be impossible for any of us to do anything about keeping climate under control as we navigate through what Sir David King, one of the most eminent climate scientists in the world, has said, the next 3 to 4 years, what we do in the next 3 to 4 years are absolutely critical in determining the future of humanity. What was observed by almost everyone, from Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, who was actually one of the first people to alert the public way back in the early 1980s about climate change, is that in some ways the climate movement is responsible because we haven't been successful in either waking up the public or compelling governments to change policies in any meaningful way. It's worth noting that the largest delegation at COP26 was from the oil industry, and they were officially part of several major delegations and spent lavishly. There was a report in the New York Times day before yesterday that said the financial institutions were more present at COP26 than ever before, in collusion with the oil interests. And as you all heard, the platitudes, we're going to get through this by 2050. And in the meantime, we're not going to do anything of a real substantive level. And the article was pointing out that 10, even 5 years ago, most of the people at the COPs were governments and climate activists and scientists. And now, over the last couple of COPs, it's much more oil, gas, coal industry, financial industry, all those forces that are working fiercely to keep business as usual very firmly in place. So I emphasize this as we begin our conversation today, because the challenge for those of us of goodwill, those of us who are working tirelessly to turn this thing around, is now shorter in time frame and more limited in scope. So we committed in the aftermath of COP26 to have a series of conversations with people of eminence in the climate movement who've been working valiantly. And we heard from Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion. And for Roger, it's all about direct action, that the people en masse, in his view, need to come out into the streets. And that if we would do it in a concerted way, we could turn this thing around even in 6 months, which is the time frame that we need to be thinking about as we consider the most efficacious and consequential strategic frame that we can employ. Today, we want to talk with someone who has been known in the climate movement and the progressive movement for many, many years, Rob Hopkins. Rob Hopkins has written, I think, about a half a dozen books on various aspects of the transition movement and social affairs and environmental concerns over the last several decades. He's from Totnes in England, and he has really distinguished himself by spawning a movement that is now worldwide, of cities of all sizes and geographic locations, communities, hamlets, intentional eco-villages, all kinds of communities that have been part of a transition movement, as they've been, in many cases, going off grid, in many cases, taking back control in the local area of their economics and their governance, as a way for all of us to have an option to be in as much of an autonomous way of being in the world as we possibly can at this crucial moment. So Rob, I want to welcome you. Most people have heard of the transition movement, and so you, as the founder of that movement, among others, I know, but the principal impulse. We want to hear your views today on how you assess the current world situation, what priorities you would set for the climate movement as we consider our options, as I've indicated. But why don't we start with you just telling your story. Tell us where you grew up. Tell us how you became aware of the environmental issues and what led you to create the transition movement, and then we'll take the conversation from there. But
well,
welcome.
yeah. Hi, Jim, and hi, everybody. Lovely to see you all and to be invited here. Thank you. So, I don't know. I grew up in London. I went to school. I was nothing particularly of much interest. I guess the first thing that was a big influence on me was punk when I was about 13. Was something that really inspired me, all of that sort of do-it-yourself culture. And I remember a thing from the time that showed how to play 3 chords on a guitar and said, here are 3 chords, now form a band. And I always really loved that kind of spirit of, really, is it that difficult? And then from the age of 18 to 21, I lived in Italy in a big Buddhist center there, which was a really formative thing as well in my life, sort of learning about stillness and compassion and meditation, and met with some extraordinary teachers when I was there. That was kind of my life university time, I guess, in some ways. And then I had about a year and a half traveling in India and Pakistan and Tibet and things like that. And then when I came back from traveling, somebody gave me Bill Mollison's Permaculture Designer's Manual, the permaculture beast of a book at the time. And I remember opening it, and it had this term of earth repair. And it kind of blew my mind that someone had written a book about earth repair, had gone around, studied all the different kind of sort of indigenous systems and traditional food and farming systems and good design, and had put together this guide for how to put the world back together again. And so I just committed myself from that moment to learning as much about this as I could. I did my permaculture course. I did the first sort of sustainability degree that was available at the time. Then I moved to Ireland with my young family, and we spent about 10 years there learning how to build straw bale houses and cob houses and clay plasters and hemp and growing food. I set up the first 2-year full-time permaculture course in the world at a college there, did a lot of that sort of thing. And then in 2005, we moved back to the UK and to Totnes. And then that's where we started the transition movement, just kind of as an experiment, really, to see if something might work in this town. But it just took off like a rocket, and I've been trying to catch up with it ever since. And you'll now find transition groups in about 50 countries. So I live in Totnes with my family. We're all a bit older now. 2 of my kids live at home. 2 of them are up and gone. My wife's very, very involved in Extinction Rebellion. I'm very involved in transition. And at the moment, I seem to spend a lot of my time in a mixture between supporting the transition movement, supporting some key local projects, and doing good things, drawing,
doing God's work.
doing God's work. Absolutely. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, Rob, why don't you describe for us the genesis of the transition movement, the fundamental principles of the transition movement. Give us some examples of some successful transitional movement communities, just so everyone has a sense of the underpinning philosophical principles and what they look like operationally at different levels and scales.
I always like to think, all the sort of great leap forwards, I think, come when people go, what happens if I put this together with this? I've got some James Brown records and a Led Zeppelin record. What happens if I play around with those? Oh, I've invented hip hop. It's like that. And so for me, transition came from taking permaculture principles and saying, how do we mainstream these and really scale them up? And looking at it through a kind of climate change, energy depletion kind of a lens. So it was a kind of we were exploring the question of, when you really get climate change and the scale and the urgency and what's at risk, then of course there are the things that we need to do on our own as individuals. We need to stop flying so much, eat less meat, all of that kind of stuff, which I'm sure all of your listeners here know about. There's all the things we need the government to do, and we'll talk about COP, I'm sure, and that the stuff that should have happened there, and what international governments need to do. But our feeling was always there's a bit in the middle that's often missing, which is the bit about what can you do where you are with the people around you, with the resources you have, the passions of the people around you. What can you create there? So it really started out as we talk about it now as being a movement of communities who are reimagining and rebuilding the world. And those two things are absolutely vital, that we do both of those, that transition groups create, I think, a really important and very, very rare these days, a what if space, like a space where people can come together, really learn and internalize and understand the situation we have, but then work out with each other what they're going to do about it. So you asked what it looks like on the ground. It can range from anything like starting a repair cafe like Transition Pasadena in LA, which is this amazing repair cafe that runs 13 times a year. And they have this lovely thing where they say, you can bring whatever you like, iPad, phone, shoes, curtains, we'll fix it for free. But while you repair it, you sit in a chair opposite us and you tell us a story about your life. So I always think, well, what are they repairing really in this time of this epidemic of loneliness? What are they really repairing? Through to then more ambitious things like new community gardens, through to things like creating new farms, new CSA projects, community energy companies, some of which now are really ambitious. And there are a couple in England who've raised like 12, 13, 14 million pounds of investment from local people to go into renewable energy projects. In the city of Liège, they are reimagining that city's food system from the ground up in the most extraordinary way. They've started 27 new cooperatives there in the last few years. They've raised 5 million euros of investment from local people. It's the model whereby the universities, the hospitals, the schools are reimagining their procurement. And what I've really loved about it, Jim, I think, is that we often have that idea that the way change happens is in quite a linear process, right? We'll do this, and then that will happen. And the more money we can raise to do this many petitions, we'll get this much reaction. What's so fascinating about transition is I think that it's more like inoculating somewhere with a kind of a mycorrhizal fungus that will then run. And sometimes it will fruit in a place where you expect, and sometimes it will fruit in a place that you really didn't see coming at all. And that's absolutely I love seeing that. If you're a control freak, the transition movement would be a terrifying thing to try and coordinate. But actually what it does is it runs in the world and all sorts of amazing things happen. And so I was in France recently. I went to Grenoble there, where the mayor is very excited about transition. I met somebody who said, oh, you came here and gave a talk 5 years ago, and that led to my job being created. And after you came, the mayor created a transition team, and now a whole load of us work in the transition team in that municipality. I've been to different places there where that model in Liège, the food belt model, is now spreading all across the French-speaking world to city after city. In Marseille, that's what they're planning to do there. If you have shares in Sodexo in France, who are the company who do all the catering for all the school meals, I would suggest to get rid of them, because I think it's really now that as that process ripples on, broken and new models get put in place, actually you start to see a new future being born in a way that actually, with ideas that could only come from the community organizing itself. And
Rob, describe exactly what that model is.
So that model basically, so in Liège, I went there in 2014. Liège is a mid-sized post-industrial city. In 2014, the transition group there came up with a question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in this city came from the land closest to this city? Brilliant question, because it makes you think, yes, actually, what would that be? I want to see that. That's got to happen. So then I went to an event where they launched this. They invited everyone who cared about food in the city to come together, academics and farmers and shopkeepers, all sorts of different people. And then I came home, didn't hear very much. I went back 4 years later. And in that time in Liège, they started, like I said, 27 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros. It's now how they're reimagining all the food system in the city. They started a shop called the Small Producers in the center of the city, which is doing so well. They now have 4. They have a local currency that runs through the whole thing. I met the mayor of the city who said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is now the story of our city. This is where we're going. So you could see this kind of reimagining. And the bit that I love was speaking to a guy who had raised 2.5 million euros of community investment to start a cooperative vineyard. And I said to him, how did you do that? Like, what made you think, oh yeah, we could raise 2.5 million euros to start a cooperative vineyard? And he looked at me a bit puzzled. He said, it's Belgium. People like wine. People have money. Don't be afraid. So I passed that advice on to everybody, and we used it here in my town to convert the brewery that I started here into the UK's first 100% community-owned brewery. We had the same thing. It's Totnes. People like beer. People have don't be afraid. And I think we can expand that out to all sorts of different things. So it's very much a kind of a, what I always say to people is, when you look at the climate emergency in the UK, our average carbon footprint is 8.5 tons. I imagine it's probably a bit more in the US, but here it's 8.5 tons. To stay below 1.5 degrees, by 2030, that needs to be 2.5 tons. By 2050, that needs to be 0.8 tons. Now, we could either look at that, like a lot of people do, and go, ooh, I can't imagine that. That's impossible. Let's just not even go there. Or we can be the people who go, right, great, okay. What's that going to look like? Let's get really imaginative about this. This is an amazing historic opportunity to reimagine everything: food, transport, education, which is what the podcast that I do is all about. Let's really look into what that stuff would be like. So, so the transition movement is the people who go, right, great, okay, what might that be like? Rather than the people who go, I can't even imagine it.
And as the transition movement has been kind of spawning now to 50 countries, is there a network, sort of a global governance kind of a network that brings everyone together to share information and solutions and challenges? How does that work as the movement has grown and diversified and expanded? How does it all kind of stay together in a cohesive whole?
That's a very good question, and for me, it's one of the things that's been most beautiful about seeing this thing emerge over the last 12, 13, 14 years. So at the beginning, it was myself and another guy in Totnes, and all these people were writing from like New Zealand and Brooklyn and Brixton and saying, hey, what are you doing? How does it work? And we had to say, we actually have no idea what we're doing here. We're just making this up as we go along and documenting what happens and trying things out. And then we then got to a position where it was happening in so many different places that we needed an organization called Transition Network, which we set up as a charity to support that movement, with the idea from the beginning that its role was to give away as much of the power that it held as possible. So we now have 50 countries where transition is happening. In 26 of those countries, they have what we call a hub. So like Transition Belgium, Transition Germany. So it's a national organization. So if you are in Germany or indeed in the US and you're doing transition, your primary relationship is with Transition US or Transition Germany. And they run the trainings. They are your point of contact. They support the network in that place. So ultimately, the idea of Transition Network doesn't need to exist anymore, because every country has a national hub, and then we can just sort of leave it to it, really. So it's as it's grown, it has grown as it has, I think, because there's an enormous amount of trust in it. And I always tell the story about 3 years into transition emerging. I got invited up to London by a group of successful business people who rang me up and said, "You are a social entrepreneur," which I'd never heard that term before. So I said, "Oh, thank you. That's very nice of you." And they said, "Come up to London and give us a 15-minute presentation about what you do. And then if we like it, we'll offer you support in various kind of ways." So I went up to London, I gave my presentation, 15 minutes. At the end of it, there's a long pause, a long silence. And then this man says, so what you've done is create a very powerful brand and given it away for free to people all over the world, and you have no control over them at all. I said, yeah, that's exactly what we've done. Yeah. He said, that's completely mad. Like for him, that's like, what? That's terrifying. You can't do that. But it's the beauty of this movement for me, is that every week there's stories where you're like, wow, will you look at what they're doing in a city in Iran? Wow, would you look what they're doing here? And that only comes about because there's so much trust put into the process. So if people want to find out more, in the shorter answer to your question, have a look at transitionnetwork.org. You can find everything on there. There's stuff on about all the different national hubs. There's lots and lots of resources on there, which people will find really useful. And there's also a really great free download called The Essential Guide to Doing Transition, which is our kind of distilled learning from this movement of how to get started. Because actually, just to finish, I think it's, we always say to people, the resources are free. You don't have to pay an annual membership fee to be part of the transition movement. You just get on with it. The only commitment is that you share your stories. So actually, if transition is anything, it's a movement of story. And the idea that on we can't figure out how to do this, but if enough people in enough places are trying to figure it out and sharing their stories in a culture that celebrates success as much as failure, then I think we might be onto something.
Now, there have been a number of questions in the chat, Rob, that I think are of interest. One is around the relationship between the kind of upstart entrepreneurial impulse of the transition movement and the entrenched interests. So take Liège, for example, as they began to talk about, well, let's just grow our food in the local area. Obviously, that comes into a contradiction with the established global food supply, supermarket, industrial agriculture machine that basically controls world food production and transportation and consumption. So what's been the experience of the transition movement, I would say generally, as they come in with a new impulse, and how do they interact against established interests? What's been the experience so far?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that quite a lot of the time, increasingly, a lot of these projects are really pushing on open doors. That in the UK now, in opinion polls, climate change and the environment is now top of people's concerns. It's been something that has been around 80% of people saying we need to take strong action on climate change for the last couple of years. When we started the transition movement, I would have been amazed if it was even 30 or 40%. So public awareness is catching up, I think, and lots of local governments are really, really keen on taking this really taking this forward a lot faster. Like I meet a lot of mayors and local governments in particularly in the French-speaking world when I go there to meet with different local governments and stuff, and they're all really, I think, genuinely keen and enthusiastic on really ramping this up. So I think often we're pushing on closed doors. I think the thing in Liège, I don't know what opposition it has encountered. I don't think it has very much, really. I mean, I'm thinking of one project that I'm involved with here in my town, where the community has spent 12 years trying to become its own developer, and for the community to build houses and create jobs and new workspace, which for me feels like the vital next step up. If we're building a new economy, and you in your preamble at the beginning, you talked about, where do we go from here as movements, which we may come back to. But I feel like one of the key things is we have to be building a new economy, and we have to be building jobs for people. And we've been trying to do that. And then we got I don't know if is gazumped a word in American. We got kind of swindled at the last minute through a deceitful sleight of hand, where the site was instead sold after 12 years of work by this community to a private developer, and we're now in a battle to try and get the site back from the developer. And I think what that boiled down to was that the guy in the company selling the site just couldn't imagine that a community could become a developer, because he'd never seen it anywhere before. He hadn't seen it on the telly. He hadn't been a storyline in any of the soap operas he watches. It wasn't a story that was celebrated in any of the news. So when this community said, we're going to become the developer of this site, he just couldn't imagine it and thought, well, actually, the only people who can do development are private companies, so we'll sell it to them. Never mind the fact that they've, invested a huge amount of money and worked really hard on doing this stuff. So there are times, I think, when you come up against that stuff, but I think often it's much more to do with a crushing lack of imagination rather than some sort of coordinated attempt to fight back against this kind of thing. And actually, what I see when I go to France is a real hunger, particularly among younger people, but many people now in local government, to really rethink. And someone I just saw in the chat just mentioned donut economics. Donut economics is a fantastic model for this, and it dovetails beautifully with the transition movement as well.
Yeah, we've had a course with Kate Rayworth, and she's been on Humanity Rising a number of times. That was a question I was just going to ask, having noted it, is the relationship between the transition movement and donut economics, because I would imagine the transition movement just intuitively, even without reading the book, would be engaging in some variation of donut economics.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I spent a couple of years researching the last book that I wrote about imagination. And one of the things that's most fascinating to me about imagination is the human imagination thrives with limits. Dr. Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham because his publisher, challenged him to write a book that just used 50 words. And he always said it was the best exercise his imagination ever had, was writing a book that just used 50 words. So we know that when we recognize limits and work within limits, we can be so much more imaginative. It's what I see in every transition group that I go to. And what donut economics does is it defines the sweet spot.
Exactly.
It's in place. And what I've seen when I've been to workshops with Kate on donut economics is that once you define that, even with a very mainstream business audience, once you define that space and say, you can't go that way, you can't go that way, we're working in here, what are we going to do? Actually, then you just start thinking like a transition person. For me, they go beautifully together. And what it does is, donut economics is a beautiful tool for firing people's imagination to really focus on that bit.
Yeah, you were talking about the power of story. There's also the power of an image. I mean, to reduce economics down to a donut is a stroke of genius.
It's genius,
because everybody loves donuts. Everybody knows what they are, and everybody can get human thriving within the larger circle of ecological systems and constraints. So it feels to me that in some ways the transition movement was applied donut economics before Kate wrote the book. And,
it's sorry, I spoke over you.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think in lots of ways, the transition movement was like for me, I had been very involved in the permaculture movement, as I said. So we were, I wanted to try. The thing with permaculture is always really hard to explain to people. What's permaculture? You have to go and get a flip chart and a pen, and you have to start drawing chickens and greenhouses and orchards and apples, or arrows connecting all these different things up together. It's not like a snappy, it's that, and people go, aha. So when I first had my real sort of climate change dark night of the soul, and then I read David Holmgren's incredible book, which is called Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which is amazing, where he reframed those principles in terms of permaculture. Then I was like, okay, what are we going to do? Come on, we've got it. Let's go. And actually, a lot of the movement at that time, and it is changing a lot since then, but at that time seemed to actually be quite happy in a niche and in a very sort of anti-mainstream, sort of wanting to change society, but also didn't really want to engage with it very much. And so our thinking was, what if we designed a kind of a Trojan horse that you could put permaculture and Joanna Macy and green economics and all those things, but you could just wheel it past everybody in through the city gates and they go, oh, it's just that transition thing, you know? So transition was like a kind of a Trojan horse for loads of things, but it didn't take so much time to explain to people. And what I always found fascinating was people who were really involved in transition for a long time would then go and study permaculture in spite of never having read anything about it and sit there going, I know all this stuff. They sort of absorb it by osmosis. David Holmgren, someone is asking, Holmgren. He's the co-founder of the permaculture movement. And he wrote a book called Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which is one of the great works of genius of the last 20 years, I think.
You know, another question, Rob, is around inner transition and the interior qualities that we all need to recognize and cultivate within our own beings in order to have the fortitude and the radical imagination, which I want to get to more extensively in a moment. But what role does inner work play in the transition movement?
So I at the very beginning of transition, it was myself and a guy called Naresh Jangrande. So we were kind of two men who had this sort of idea. And after about a month of us doing things and showing films, it was before it was even called transition. It was just like, there was something there that wanted to be kind of born, and it was sort of taking shape. But we were just starting to think, I think maybe someone in Ireland had just come up with this word transition. And we've gone, yeah, that's what it is. It's about transition. And I got a knock on the door, and there were two women there, Sophie Banks and Hilary Prentice, who had a long kind of background in kind of eco-psychology, Joanna Macy's work, sort of facilitating inner group processes, this kind of stuff, who came and said, if this is going to work and if this is going to have the longevity it needs to have, then you need to also look at the inner aspects of this. And they were both extraordinary, and that's been very much in the DNA from the beginning, kind of thanks in large part to them. And so in the transition, we always is now a key part of it. So if you go and do a transition training, a 2-day training of how to start transition, a lot of that is about the inner side of it, how to avoid burnout, how to run good meetings, how to make good decisions, how to manage conflict, all that kind of stuff. And for a lot of people, I think transition is very much, it's the how we do things matters as much as what we do, that we don't replicate the paradigm that we're trying to replace in how we build what comes next. So there's lots of resources and training around this idea of inner transition. How do we manage how do we work with the grief? How do we design in the resilience? How do we support each other? We've lost so many people out of these movements over the years through burnout. People who I've stood shoulder to shoulder with for a long time who just got burnt out, and we can't have that, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so for me, it's one of the things that's most fascinating. And I guess one of the practical manifestations of it is that in my town, anyone who's watching this who knows Totnes will know, probably as a town, we have more psychotherapists per square meter than anywhere else in the UK. And so quite early on, there was a challenge to them to say, okay, this process is up and running. What's your role? How are you going to support it? And there was a group of people who were therapists and counselors who said, our role is to support this process. So everybody who worked at the heart of the transition group in our town, when they felt they needed it, had access to free counseling support, whatever they wanted it. And it made an enormous difference, I think, in terms of reducing rates of burnout. And certainly for me, there were times over the last 15 years when that has kind of been a real lifesaver, having that space to just go and really make sense of what's happened. Because one of the things is when you do this kind of work in a community, those of us who get drawn to this kind of work aren't people who are necessarily used to encountering a lot of kind of kind of blowback and sort of, when you put your head above the parapet, sometimes it cannot be a nice place to be. And we're not really prepared for that. So to have support when that kind of thing happens as well is hugely valuable. So yeah, if people have a look at the Transition Network website, you'll find lots of resources on there about inner transition. And it's really an integral key part of this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit more deeply about radical imagination. It was one of your recent podcasts, actually, and I know you've written extensively on it, because if there's ever been a moment when the world generally, but also the movement needs radical imagination so that we can think more creatively out of the box, it's now. So speak to us about your sense of what radical imagination is. How do we nurture it in ourselves? Maybe some examples of where it's worked in the transition movement, because it's such an important concept, Rob. It's actually might be at the heart of what we now need to do as a movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started researching it because I kept reading people like Bill McKibben, who you mentioned earlier, Naomi Klein, George Monbiot, people who I really respect, who kept saying climate change is a failure of the imagination. And then they'd move off onto something else. And I was left there going, whoa, how, what did you mean? That was really interesting. Why would climate change be because of a failure of imagination? And Mariam Kaba, who is a phenomenal prison abolitionist writer in the US, she wrote a book called We Do This Till We Free Us, which is just brilliant. I recommend to everybody. She said in there, we live in a system that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability. How many people at COP26 actively are imagining what a truly radically low carbon future would look like? It's like people actually, most of the people there, it seemed to me, were bargaining with physics, and you can't bargain with physics. You can't haggle with physics. We have to make the cuts that we have to make. And that requires us being able to imagine something else. Walida Imarisha, who's an amazing activist in the US, she says, you cannot build what you cannot imagine. And all great radical movements in history are able to create an I have a dream kind of a narrative, something that you want to run towards. And it's not just enough to point out all the things that are wrong. We also have to paint pictures of what could come next that are so exquisite and delicious that it becomes inevitable that that's where we want people to go. And absolutely, we need, of course, you mentioned Rupert Reed earlier on, and Roger Hallam. We need the kind of the non-violent, what I call the big, bold, beautiful no, but we also need the big, bold, beautiful yes that goes along with that, because we have to, so when I was researching the book, for example, one of my favorite stories that I found out in there, which I only found out a week before the deadline to hand the manuscript in, I was like, how did I not hear about this? I was chasing about trying to find things, was from Bologna in Italy, where they created where the municipality in Bologna created what they called a civic imagination office, not a civic engagement office or a participation office, specifically a civic imagination office with 6 laboratories around the city that would run big kind of visioning exercises with people. But the brilliant bit was that when people came up with a good idea, the municipality would sit with them and say, that's a great idea. Okay, let's make it happen. We can offer this, this, and this. You can offer that and that. Good. Let's make a pact. So what they did was they invited the imagination of the people, and then they met it in the middle. And this is what we need to see an awful lot more of, I think. There's a thing in London, Camden, which is the part of London where Amy Winehouse came from, just to give it a bit of context. They were the first council who created a climate emergency declaration, and the first council to do a citizens' assembly on the climate. And they then created, together with the Extinction Rebellion group and the local transition group, they turned an old cafe into what they called Think and Do, which was a kind of community imagining space where people could come together well facilitated. Gil Scott-Heron always said the revolution will not be televised. I'd like to think if he was doing it now, it would be the revolution will be well facilitated, because and I'm waiting for the t-shirts with that written on because I want one. And because actually those are the skills that we need so much, is how we facilitate these kind of group processes in such a way that really invites people to imagine things could be different. So the book From What Is to What If is really an exploration into what's the state of health of our collective imagination in 2021. Why does it matter? What would it look like if we set out to rebuild that with huge urgency across education, technology, science, and everything? And then I mentioned the podcast before, From What If to What Next. What we do on that is then every episode takes a different what if question and explores it with two guests in such a way that, rather than having an intellectual debate about whether a universal basic income is a good idea, we start by saying, okay, let's imagine there already is a universal basic income and it was implemented 8 years ago. What's it like? Does the air smell differently? Does food taste differently? Does it sound differently when you walk down the street? So it's taking people who are activists who work in particular ways, but trying to get out of their head the kind of like that gets them out of bed every morning, because that's what we need to have in our guts, I think, is that kind of fresh way of looking at the world.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. One thinks of Einstein's that imagination is more important than knowledge.
Yeah.
And how would you define what imagination is?
My favorite definition of imagination comes from John Dewey, who is an educationalist, who described it as the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. Which I feel like if ever there was a superpower people needed in 2021, it's the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. And it was a thing that I got when I did my permaculture course in 1992. It felt like my brain got rewired so that I could then walk down a street, and rather than just looking at it as it is, I could see how it could be. So I could start to see all the vertical spaces as potential space for climbing plants. I could see the flat roof spaces as being places where things could be grown. I could imagine where the rainwater could be stored. I could see all the lawn as being potential food garden, in the same way that, to go back to Sodexo, we need to move to seeing every Sodexo contract for school catering as being a potential co-op, that we see every big energy company as being a potential network of smaller energy companies. And it's that ability to move from what is to what if, or like to have a sort of a pair of possibilities glasses that mean that we look at things differently, which is so important, because in terms of the national debates on this stuff, it's just so sort of tepid, and people get so stuck on the way the government talks and the narratives that we get in the media just take away all the possibility. During COVID, there was a time when we already had a massive homelessness crisis, but people were saying, what if actually now this was the moment to home everybody? And the government said, we're going to make short-term hostels available for people for a few weeks or something. It's like, so you took a kind of a bold sort of what if, and they just squished all the possibility out of it and said, no, we're just going to do this little thing, So it's like the imagination just pulls it back out again and goes, no, actually, the only thing that is appropriate now is, as Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left. If what you're proposing isn't really radical, then it's just not appropriate anymore. Sorry. And so we need, COVID has shown us that we can't just move in little short, the myth that we can only move in small little incremental steps was always a myth anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's a point of Naomi Klein's, that there are no more non-radical solutions left. I think is where the world has ended up, sort of post COP26. And within that context, I would love to just hear your current assessment, Rob, of where the world is in relationship to Sir David King, for example, and his assertion we've only got 3 to 4 years left, because the context within which we really are will shape the level of radical imagination we need to exercise. So I would think everyone would love to hear your current assessment of the climate crisis. Do you take the same view as, say, a Roger Hallam, that we are now getting down to a few years, certainly months, to do anything, and therefore his imaginal frame is massive, highly disruptive, direct action. But what's your view, your assessment of the kind of the global objective situation now? How do you view it? What's happening?
So I was up in Glasgow for the first week of COP, and it was kind of hugely inspiring and profoundly heartbreaking, kind of simultaneously. I guess for me, Kevin Anderson, who is one of the sanest voices in terms of interpreting the climate science, has a good reputation for not saying what he thinks politicians want to hear, which isn't always the case. He gave an interview at COP where he said, I would say that the chances of staying below 1.5 degrees is now about 5%. But there is a 5% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. And actually, and as long as that chance is there, I intend to absolutely fight for it in everything that I do. And my as I said, my wife is very involved in Extinction Rebellion. She's been arrested about 5 times. She's extraordinary. I'm very proud of her. She's far braver than I am in terms of doing that kind of thing. And I think we absolutely need civil disobedience, non-violent civil disobedience. Although I worry that in the UK, the police have got it figured out now. It's less impactful than it was because the police have sort of caught up with it a bit. And I think that we may be, I know there are lots of conversations going on within Extinction Rebellion and other organizations about, well, where do we go from here and what do the tactics look like? And I think everybody is actually in the transition movement. People are saying, well, where do we go from here? I do talks for XR groups where people are saying maybe we need to be more like transition. I do talk for transition groups where people say maybe we need to be more like Extinction Rebellion groups. I was really struck in Glasgow, actually, and Christiana Figueres wrote a really good piece with her reflections on it, where she said it was a city of two tales. And I was in Paris for COP21 in 2015, and the gap at COP26 between civil society and the politicians and the formal process felt much bigger and much, much harder to bridge than it had been before. The level of kind of cynicism about what was going on in there and how little was going to come out of it from the beginning. Greta Thunberg and people who from the beginning were saying, blah, 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 was kind of their phrase. And I have friends who were part of the British delegation in the talks. And one of them said to me, actually, blah, blah, blah is unfair because it's not like there was nothing happening. And actually, yes, it's true. If it was an exam, we maybe got 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10, but at least we got 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10. It's fine to bash us for the things that didn't happen, but it's also good to point out the good things that did happen. But where are we now? I think the US is really, really tricky in terms of where things go over the next 3 or 4 years politically. That there's so much kind of involved in that. But actually, globally, I feel like coal is finished. I feel like the narrative is really moving away from kind of oil and gas very, very quickly. Huge amounts of money moving into the right kinds of things. But there was actually, in your intro, there was one thing. I watched a film last night called Dark Waters, the Mark Ruffalo film about the DuPont poisoning stuff, which was an amazing film. I really recommend it. It's on Netflix. And you said at the beginning in your introduction something about the degree to which the climate movement is to blame, could take some blame for what's happened and things not moving fast enough. Actually, I kind of would challenge it a bit because I watched that film last night about the people who were being poisoned by DuPont and the resistance they met of denial and the political systems they were up against and all of the dark money that came in to discredit them. Same with tobacco. We could have campaigned all we liked against tobacco, but we were up against a massive, well-funded disinformation machine that could buy politicians, that could buy policymakers. So actually, yeah, maybe in some ways there's a bit of blame, but it's like I know so many extraordinary people working so hard in this movement. And the beautiful thing about being a cop is you meet those people. You meet people who walk 2 days through the forest to the place where they could get the bus in order to come to cop, to talk to people about what was happening to their lands. You met young people from Africa whose air and water and land that should have been their inheritance has just been trashed by Shell. So you meet the most incredible people. I don't feel like the climate movement isn't doing as well as it should be because it's somehow failing. It's just up against something which is entrenched and huge and well-resourced and incapable of imagining its own demise. And so we need to give everybody more and more stories that gives them hope that something else other than this is possible. And I take a lot of courage from a survey recently that was done of people who work in North Sea oil and gas, which said that 80% of people who work in North Sea oil and gas would much rather work in renewables. It's not like most of these systems exist because the people who work in them love them. It's because there's nothing for them to step onto, and they can't imagine anything else.
Yeah.
Do everything we can to build the systems that come next.
Yeah. Beautifully put. One question that's come in, which I'd love to hear your comment on, from Kat Haber. She says, when I speak of this urgent timeline, people who are not focused on climate tell me that mentioning this timeline makes them not believe the urgency. How might we communicate this more effectively? I mean, that's an extraordinary paradox, isn't it? That the kind of the worse the situation gets, the shorter the time frame. When you tell people that, they don't believe it. Just the diminishing time frame somehow causes them to tune out. But then I'm sure you've had that experience many times before.
Yeah, totally.
How do you understand that?
But then again, it's like I said before, in terms of how we shouldn't beat ourselves up that somehow we're to blame for not doing enough. The systems of the narrative systems and the media that we're up against and the messages that people get day in and day out, no wonder that actually there's no great sense of urgency. But then there was the film that went on TV of the turtle with a straw up its nose, and we've managed to get rid of plastic straws within about a year. Like actually when there is a sense of urgency with COVID, think of all the things that have changed. We saw companies who make motors for Formula One racing cars repurpose their factories to building ventilators within about 6 weeks. We saw craft breweries go over to making hand sanitizer within a couple of weeks. Actually, when people decide to change, things can change incredibly quickly. If all the narratives that people encounter are like, and also the thing that always drives me mad is the people who spent ages going, I don't think there's a problem. I don't think climate change is really a problem, and I don't think we need to do anything. It's not really a problem. Who are now saying, well, it's too late. I'm like, what? What happened to the bit in the middle? If your house catches fire, you don't sort of smell smoke. You just sit there and go, I can't smell any smoke. Oh, my house has burnt down. There's the bit in the middle where you ring the fire brigade or you get the hose or you do something, and also the other bit to that question, I think, is I've tried the thing of trying to talk to people who think this is all rubbish, or what Michael Mann calls inactivists. The people who are like, from one reason or another, are like, no, you can't do that. It won't work. It'll be too expensive. It's like, we have limited time. We all have limited energy. We have families. We have kids. We have a job. We have other commitments. We give a certain amount of our time to trying to transform the world in the way that it needs to be transformed. Don't waste that time on people who you have to sort of go back to the basics and explain it all up from. Actually, find the people around where you are. And this is kind of what's beautiful for me about the transition movement. Find the people around you who already care about this stuff and who feel passionate about this stuff and who want to do something, and then start working with those people. And actually what you'll find in my experience here in Totnes was that then once you do projects that are just the things that need to be done, they're not a left-wing project, they're not a right-wing project, they're not a socialist project or a conservative project. They're planting trees because we need to plant trees, because if we don't, we're going to have more floods running off the land into our town, because we want to plant food for people. We're going to start a community energy company because we need energy security, and if we own it, then that's better for the local economy. You know, I've been part of projects with people who voted for Brexit, with people who are across the political spectrum, but we're working on something together because we all really want that thing to happen. And so try and find those people and work with those people, and actually you'll also find it transformative in your sense of what might be possible, because all of a sudden you feel part of making change happen rather than trying to convince people, which is just exhausting.
Well said. Well said. You're reminding me of this classic definition between the optimist and a pessimist is not their analysis. It's just that the optimist thinks that there's something that they can do about it. Yeah. And, you know, and I think you're so right, Rob, you know, even when there's only 5% probability left, it's in the 5% that we need to be with all our hearts and with all our souls, and as collaboratively as we possibly can be. I mean, I mentioned before Mariame Kaba, who wrote We Do This Till We Free Us. You know, for me, there's so much that we can learn from radical Black political movements in terms of how do you keep really audacious what if questions alive over time. You know, what if there were no prisons? For me, is just one of the most phenomenal what if questions around at them, and to keep that question alive for decades and decades, and then all that it then opens up in terms of what does justice need to look like? How do we properly resolve? Why are we seeing crime problems? What does it mean in terms of policing? What does it mean in terms of education and health, and where money is invested? You know, there's the ability to ask really great what if questions is something that we all need to get much better at, I think. Absolutely, in every domain. Not just
domain.
In climate, but in COVID. Just imagine if there was a whole plethora of what if questions around the pandemic in terms of other possibilities for curing, other possibilities of building your immune system, other possibilities of community healing, just other possibilities of being vibrantly alive in our world. So you're absolutely correct. Well, Rob, I really want to thank you for this inspiration. It's been a wonderful, wonderful tonic, I would say, after you know, some of the pessimism that crept in after COP26. And I'm wondering, just in closing, what counsel would you give us for how do we cultivate, I would say, the interior scaffolding for radical imagination? Because I could not agree with you more that if there's one ingredient we need right now, it's a way to reimagine the world at a time when non-radical solutions are no longer possible, so that we need radical imagination at every level. Just as we close, how can we cultivate that capacity in ourselves and in our communities?
So I think we have to recognize that initially that imagination to a degree is a function of privilege, that if your basic needs aren't met for food and shelter and safety, it's very hard to live an imaginative life. If you experience systemic racism and economic exclusion, it's very, very hard to live an imaginative life. We have to recognize that imagination needs time and space. So if we if we're just busy all the time, if we allow the highly addictive devices we carry around in our pockets to devour all of the time when we would otherwise be writing poems, looking out the windows, going for long dreamy walks, and instead we just, the chief exec of Netflix was recently asked who he regarded as being their main competition, and he said it wasn't Apple or Sky or anyone, it was sleep. So our imagination, our attention span is under huge assault. I think we need to learn to play more. We need to bring more play into our activism. Create more space, whether it's through meditation, yoga, walking in the woods, making art, whatever it is that we give ourselves time and space. And I think we have to recognize that at its best, imagination is something that we do together with other people. And so that we need to create those kind of what if spaces where people can come to think about the world in a different way. But then also always remember that then if you then go out and do something with it and you create something, even if it's just planting a few trees, whatever it is, or more ambitious things, it then starts to change other people's sense of what's possible. And this stuff can kind of become infectious. Yeah, I would also just say in a little plug that if people are interested in this, and so the podcast that I do from What If to What Next, you can find it on all different podcast platforms. But also, if you wanted to, patreon.com/from what if to what next, you can subscribe, and that really helps to make it, and you get the episodes when they first come out. But every one of those explores a different what if question, and I think that that's also, one of the main things that we do, whether it's through the podcast or whether it's just through through the work that you do, through the transition movement, is we need to fill our memory with good stories of change happening. Because basically the part of your brain where the imagination comes from is the same place as where our memory comes from. And when we're being imaginative, basically we're going to the cupboards of our memory and going, what happens if I put this bit together with this bit? And that's the imagination piece, when something new and unique is formed by doing that. So it's really important to find those stories. There's an amazing French film called Tomorrow, which is full of those stories. There's other good films about permaculture. So give yourself as much time and space to seek out those solutions as you can, because we're going to need them.
We certainly will. Rob, thank you. Thank you. You've been inspiring, and you're motivating me, and I think all of us, to think more dynamically out of the box, to take time to play, take time to be with others, in a reactivation of our memories so that we can imagine more radically in this very fragile, critical moment in the human journey. So thank you.
Been a pleasure. Been a pleasure. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again tomorrow here on Humanity Rising. Those of you who can, please click the link that Stanley's put in the chat box, so you can join our after chat session. Rob, all strength to you, man. All strength. You founded an incredible movement, and nothing short than a radical reimagine of transition is going to take us to the other side. And I'm deeply grateful for your time with us today. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.